here's a quick list of some of the topics that I'll try to unpack today. We're going to do quite a bit of a Q&A session at the end, so I really want to get to the subjects that make you curious and that questions that you have. But in the meantime, we'll start with some of the basics. And I really want you to stop me if I say something that does not make sense, if you have, if you want me to back up and explain something better. I might assume that something is clear or obvious, and quite a lot of things in the immigration system are not intuitive. So you really wouldn't know them. There's nothing obvious about it. But we'll talk just a little bit on what immigration status is. How do people acquire lawful immigration status? Well, for many people, the answer is you may be born with it. And for others, it may be something that you acquire during your life. And exactly how this works through a rather complex system of laws and policies, we will spend just a little time on, not getting too much in the weeds with that. And then I want to really quickly turn our focus onto children. And I understand that's sort of the purpose of today. Why, who are these children who are migrating? Why do they migrate? And how do we treat migrant children in the US? Do we lock them in detention centers? The answer is yes, we have done that. Children can be detained and held against their will in detention centers in the United States with their parents or alone. And why do we charge them in immigration removal proceedings? There are various forms of immigration status, and among the ones that I focus on that I feel are very important are forms of humanitarian protection, because these are the forms of regularizing someone's status due to harms that they've suffered in the past, and a consensus under US law that these people deserve protection. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, and then a little bit about the changes that are coming. So I'm not a political person in my work. I work on the side of the legal services side, so my role is not to get involved or to take a political stance. I may or may not have opinions in my personal life, but in my professional life, I don't have a political position, but I can talk a little bit about the kind of changes that you could expect and how policies have, in fact, changed over time. So to start us out, just a few words about what immigration status is. The kids that we work with tend to just talk about having your papers. Do you have papers or not? And of course, they're referring to paper and authorization that gives you some form of legal status, permission to be in the United States. And it's, of course, possible to come to the United States in a variety of ways. There are people who come to the United States in a lawful status, already having permission to enter, even though they're not citizens, even though they're not nationals of the United States. They can be granted permission to enter lawfully from the beginning. And then we also work with people who enter without, my organization works with people who enter without lawful status. And that maybe in many cases it's because they are leaving behind something dangerous and seeking a safe haven. And the only option open to them to do that is to approach the border and try to enter or ask to be allowed to enter, even though they don't have any documentation entitling them to entry. Then nonetheless, when you examine the facts of that person's history, their life, their family life, and the history of what they've experienced, you may often find out that the very same things that caused them or forced them to leave their country in a hurry could be the very same things that entitle them to protection under United States law. And we have a very long tradition of offering people protection. You may differ about whether it's enough or whether it's the right people, and those are very, very legitimate policy questions to ask. Then we also have immigrants who change their status, who may enter without lawful status and later qualify to acquire lawful status. Or we also have the opposite. You could enter under a lawful status and lose it. Of course, there are a number of ways of losing status. It could be that you violate the terms of the status you were given. For example, if you came on a student visa where you were not allowed to work and you worked, that could cause you, for example, to lose that status. Or simply just staying too long. You were granted entry for a finite period and you stay a couple of days longer or a year longer or forever longer. So that is another way that you may be present in the United States but without lawful status. And the status that is granted by the government could be temporary status, it could be permanent status. It will all be spelled out in the type of status that you apply for. And I'll just do a little bit of terminology for you. I myself do not use the term illegal immigrant or illegals. I believe that there is not a human being who is, quote, illegal. The conduct that a person committed was a violation of US law. Yes, it is illegal to cross the US border without permission because we have laws restricting that. But that doesn't make the person themselves a, quote, illegal. And so I encourage people to be conscious about what kind of terminology you're using. Not, if nothing else, because it doesn't make any sense, even as a matter of English grammar. But in any case, and it's also, of course, used with an agenda. So finally, to get onto the ways that you can acquire lawful immigration status, there are some big categories that I can break it down into. And I'm not an expert in some of these categories. Again, my work focuses primarily on humanitarian relief, although sometimes I do work on family-based immigration. So it's two of the very big broad categories are family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. And it's exactly what it sounds like, getting authorization or permission to migrate based on a family relationship. Normally people who are either United States citizens or lawful permanent residents of the United States. What is lawful permanent resident? Anybody? What is that in like plain talk? Anybody? It's a green card, exactly. So normally green card holders or US citizens have the right to petition to assist someone else in acquiring lawful immigration status if it's a close relative, certain close relatives. And this list is not as long as many people might think it is. So for example, spouses, children, whether it's minor children or your adult sons and daughters, siblings, and spouses. Did I say that already? Spouses. And so it's a pretty limited list. No aunts, no uncles, no grandparents are in that way, unless of course your grandparent sponsored your parent and your parent sponsored you. That's one way that it could happen. Again, the person who is doing the sponsoring has to be one of two things, a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident and a green card holder. And then the other thing that's sort of the hidden information about this is the wait times. There's a very limited number of visas that are allotted by the US government. It's a conscious decision made through Congress. The numbers are very finite. And what does that mean? It means there's always a waiting list. For certain countries, for some not, and it really depends on supply and demand, like so many things. So when you'll sometimes hear the expression, well, why don't people get in line and why don't people do it the right way? And I wonder if the person asking that question knows that the line is 12 years long. So from certain countries, if a sibling wants to sponsor their sibling, that might be exactly the wait that they're looking at, 12 years. It could be more, it could be less. It really, again, it depends on a complicated web of categories, and we can talk in more detail about that later if it's of interest. But I'll move on just quickly to employment-based immigration. Again, it's what it sounds like. If there's an employer who wants to hire someone who doesn't have lawful US immigration status, but they'd like to hire that person as an employee, as long as it fits under the requirements that the government imposes, you need to go through a process of all the prerequisites to hiring this person and engage them according to a certain schedule, and they'll have immigration status and permission to work for that period. So employment-based immigration is a huge world, and it's something that I don't practice in at all, but it's a very interesting area. There's a lot of special categories. So small and particularized categories of people who are given special attention for different reasons. One example is a visa for entrepreneurs. If you are willing to invest a certain amount of money, there could be a way for you to migrate. And then another category could be people from certain countries where the US has a relationship, a good or bad relationship with that country, and chooses to make an avenue for their nationals. That's relatively easy to navigate. There's a number of those. And then there's sort of a visa for people of extraordinary talent, and that's where you get your skilled baseball players and supermodels who are able to get visas. And then finally, my particular area is humanitarian relief. Again, forms of hardship, or usually it's physical violence, and it could also be discrimination and persecution that people have gone through that will entitle them to receive protection in the United States. And I think that so that's something that makes me very proud that our country does that. I wish we would do it with greater generosity. But in any case, who is it that makes these decisions? Where does immigration law come from? And this might be a little bit bureaucratic, but I'll unpack this just a little bit because there are a lot of hands on immigration law in addition to the Congress, which enacts US immigration laws. But we have no less than 3 cabinet level agencies that perform major roles in US immigration law. And one of them is the Department of State, which decides who can receive a visa and allots the visas and interviews people. And that those allotments are done according to countries and categories. So that falls under the Secretary of State. John Kerry, exactly. Who's the Secretary of Homeland Security currently? Anyone? So that's a man named Jay Johnson. And who's the Secretary of the Department of Justice? So we don't call them the Secretary, right? We call them the Attorney General. And that is Loretta Lynch from Brooklyn. So exactly, all 3 of those agencies have a huge role in setting immigration policy, whether it is by deciding who gets permission to enter or not of people who are already present in the United States and want to apply for status. What are the options for applying and who qualifies or not? There's an agency devoted to the protection of the border, and particularly the southern border. And then enforcement activities also happen within the United States. And finally, immigration enforcement does entail deporting people, and technically these days it's called removal. Removal is what we in normal conversation usually call deportation. So that's just a basic family tree of who's who in immigration law. And where these rules are to be found is, again, pretty complicated. The reason I'm bringing this up is I think it's going to be more interesting at the end when we talk about the future of policy, because there are different vehicles for immigration policies, right? There are laws that Congress has to sit down, hash out, debate, and vote on. And it takes an act of Congress to change them, and that's huge. It takes quite a lot to get, of course, as you know, a law passed in the US Congress. So there is that level. Then each of those agencies that we just met, in order to implement the laws, they need to come up with regulations that fill in those little spaces in between the laws where they enacted a big idea, but they didn't go into the little details, the nitty-gritty of how you're actually going to get this done day to day. And that's where agency regulations come in. And agency regulations can change more easily than law enacted by Congress, but it is also a process, and a regulation is binding. Then there are cases that get decided by the courts, and because we have the principle that all people should be equal in front of the law, we follow the decisions that are made by a lower court will follow a decision made by a higher court if it's within the appropriate geographic region. But every case is different. Every person's facts are different. So I always explain to kids that I'm working with, because you know somebody who's from your same town and they got status, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to get status. Every case is different. Every case has to succeed or fail on its own facts. It really is, immigration law is very fact intensive. And it also goes the other way. Like, people will find out that they have an acquaintance who's been in the US for 12 years working a job that's doing pretty well for them, and they've been comfortable and they haven't had any trouble, and they're raising a family, but they have no lawful immigration status. Everything's going fine for them. Because it's going fine for your neighbor doesn't mean it's going to go fine for you. So I always tell young people that we're working with to be really careful. Everything is case by case. Agency policy is really important. Those agencies that we mentioned on the prior slide, they are, each of them, deciding how to implement policy under immigration law. Put in one little word of caution, which is if you're ever talking with someone who needs advice about an immigration situation, be careful. I would advise that person to be careful how they get it. For reasons that you can easily imagine, the immigrant population seems to get to be especially vulnerable to people who choose to run scams, who choose to take advantage that people have less knowledge of our system. And it's often many of the families that we work with are of limited means. And for them to take a hit like paying a lot of money for results that don't work is really sad and unfair. So I always encourage people to go to someone reputable and to not try to sort of navigate a complicated system on your own without advice. There's a lot of sources for free or very low-cost legal advice, and if people need to have something that's free or lower cost, it's available. It's not super available. It's tough, but it's really hazardous to try to trust somebody who doesn't deserve your trust. So there's a lot of resources including at our, the New York State Attorney General is quite active in protecting people from frauds and scams, including immigration fraud and scams. So government agencies are in charge of implementing the law. They're not in charge of your well-being, your needs, your goals. They cannot and won't consider that. They actually can't give legal advice. And they can tell you, is this form available on the website? But they can't tell you that form, you're a person qualified to fill out that form and there's no risks to you. They can't advise you about your risks or advantages for applying for immigration status or for completing a form. They can just give information about what they do and that's it. But it's not what I would call, it's not legal advice. Okay, so a little bit about children and how they're getting here. Is this a topic that people have heard quite a bit about in the news already? I think it is. It was really well covered, especially starting in 2014. So you may remember in the summer of 2014, a very big wave of unaccompanied children arrived at the southern border of the United States. And this isn't something new. It's not that children started coming to the US on their own for the first time in 2014. It was something that had been going on for generations, but the numbers really hit a critical mass, probably because of a confluence of factors in 2014, and pretty much overwhelmed the system. There was actually not enough space to actually hold all these kids or to keep them safe or to process their cases, and therefore it caught quite a lot of attention. The journey that kids undertake is a hazardous one. Some of them know what they're getting into. Some kids have told me, I had no idea it was going to be that difficult. I never would have done it if I had known. But quite a lot of kids used to come by riding on the tops of trains, in cargo spaces of boats or of trucks. And several kids have told us that at the point that immigration enforcement found them, they were relieved because they actually thought that they were not going to make it, that they were going to die of dehydration or exposure. And because the southern border is surrounded by many, many miles of desert, it's a hazardous crossing, and it's getting more hazardous as elements of organized crime get more involved in regulating the process. So it's not a legal activity to cross, and a lot of people pay or engage a smuggler to help with the journey. A smuggler is not exactly the kind of babysitter that you would leave your kid with, and they often, well, they're motivated by money, so their concern is to make the crossing, to make it with a group, to get paid. And a lot of kids have told us, yeah, the smuggler gave me some kind of powder, they made me swallow this, and it was to keep me going because I couldn't keep up, or heaven forbid that you would get hurt along the journey and start to lag behind and get left behind. So it's a dangerous undertaking. A lot of people get turned back somewhere along the way, and some people will cross the border, and if you are under a certain age, if you're under the age of 18, different laws will apply to you because you're a minor child. Here's a little bit of the statistics that I talked about. Like I said, it's a long-standing problem since the agency that detains the children, since they first got that assignment in 2003, it was a sort of steady flow for 9 years really. 7,000 or 8,000 kids would come every year. And there was plans and provisions for making sure that their rights were protected and seeing if they were entitled to immigration status. And then the number started doubling and tripling. The breakout year was 2014. And the number scaled back quite a bit last year, but this year was a huge year again. And the reason I say this year is that the government fiscal year already ended. It ended at the end of September, so that's why we're able to count the entirety of fiscal year 2016 already. So these are government statistics. They're not my numbers, but that is roughly what the wave of child immigration looks like. Why? Why does this happen? Why would you walk through the desert, cram yourself into the back of a truck, take calculated risks with strangers? Usually it's because what the child is leaving is not good. And there's a lot of different forms of violence that drive the children's exit. Sometimes they're also coming towards something. A lot of families have had to make a fairly painful decision for economic reasons, for the family to split up and for one or more parents to leave the country of origin, try to find work in the US, and it's not always feasible to bring children. Children might follow later to be reunited with the family, and it might be a combination of that desire to see a parent again, or it might be because life becomes untenable at home. The rise of gang violence in the last years has driven a huge amount of migration, and it is really appalling violence that makes countries that are really quite small have these astounding murder rates, and not just murder, but graphic violence, murder done with a message, as well as beatings, torture, kidnapping, sexual violence. That is the reality that a lot of people are facing in many Central American communities that's spurring their departure. And when you're not a person of great economic means, it's very difficult to shield yourself from this. It makes it even harder. So that, again, makes you vulnerable to labor exploitation, possibly to the commercial sex industry, or it just makes you unable to continue. If your life becomes untenable in that situation, you may choose to find safety. And the US, to many people, represents that type of safety. This clip was in the New York Times at the beginning of the child migration crisis back in 2014, and it gives you a really graphic example of very young children who are facing this exact kind of violence. Anthony was a child who disappeared from his neighborhood. One of Honduras' most dangerous cities is San Pedro Sula, and it was his little brother who got on his green bicycle to search for him, starting his hunt at a notorious gang hangout. They were found within days of each other, both dead. Anthony, 13, and a friend had been shot in the head. Kenneth, who is 7, had been tortured and beaten with sticks and rocks. And they were among 7 children murdered in their La Pradera neighborhood just in the month of April. That is a really graphic picture of what the gang violence is like. So the population that we're looking at is at a confluence of 3 really powerful vectors. The children are immigrants. They are also children, with everything that means, and they're survivors of violence. And when those 3 things come together, it's a combination where you have sort of the challenges of all 3 of those factors coming together. A lot of immigrants do face cultural and linguistic barriers. They may be inclined to distrust systems of authority based on what they've seen and experienced in their country of origin. They can also just, even though they've experienced something that deserves vindication, they may be very reluctant to report it. That's often true of crime victims. They may be fearful of causing harm to other people, especially including in their immigration status. Children, of course, are still in the process of developing. They don't all possess immediately the skills of adults for defending their rights, for even understanding their rights. It's hard for them to explain what they experience because they're not brilliant at categorizing things, interpreting things, putting things in chronological order. They may be confused about who do I trust and who do I not trust. They may encounter so many different adults with so many different roles, like the guy in the green uniform who's carrying a gun who apprehended them in the desert. They encounter a lot of different adults with different roles, and it's not easy for them to unpack. So for a child to win a court case in this kind of environment, that's the reason that KIND is dedicated to providing free legal assistance for kids. Survivors of violence also have, not to generalize, but many of the common themes that you'll see in survivors of violence. There are physical consequences of having been through trauma or violence, like nightmares or symptoms of post-traumatic stress that can stay with a person lasting quite a long duration. It can be difficult to concentrate, to make decisions. Sometimes people don't know how to present what happened to them. They can experience feelings of shame, even if it was through no fault of their own, yet there are sometimes these counterintuitive, really hard to understand reactions like feeling protective toward the abuser, especially if that abuser was a parent, or having strange reactions to the subject coming up or talking about it, like laughing at a time that seems really inappropriate. So it's all of these different challenges come together when a child's trying to navigate their immigration case. There is a technical legal definition of what an unaccompanied child is, and not to get too down in the weeds, but again, it is a person who's under 18, they don't have lawful immigration status, and they're without a parent. Either the parent's not in the US at all, or that parent is not available in a way that they can effectively provide care to the child. So what would that mean? Well, maybe the parent is incarcerated in the United States. That's one way that you could be in the United States but not available to your child. And exactly, so a little bit more in realistically, who are these children? Most of them right now who are crossing currently come from 3 countries in Central America: El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. Most of the kids are around, the average age averages out at 14 and a half, and it's still more boys than girls, about 2-to-1 ratio. Why is it that we detain children, put them in detention centers? So the process goes something like this in a nutshell. It's the Department of Homeland Security that's responsible for enforcing immigration laws. If the department suspects that a person is without lawful status, they can pursue an immigration remedy against them. They can ask for that person to be removed from the United States. But if it's detected that this person is an unaccompanied alien child, as the government calls them, then that person has automatically the right to a court hearing. Not everyone does. And since the child's unaccompanied, there's no parent around to provide care, the government will temporarily hold them in a federal facility of some kind. It could be a shelter facility or something with a higher degree of security if that's determined to be necessary. And the government is not trying to punish or they're not trying to punish the child. The goal is safety, and before they will release them from that shelter or detention situation, they will check to see whether there's an appropriate adult in the United States, who the child can live with, who can take the child to immigration court to resolve their case. A child who has gone through this system will generally be facing removal proceedings. In other words, it's a proceeding designed to resolve the question, do you have or do you merit the right to stay in the United States lawfully, yes or no? Those are the considerations. The considerations are not, what would be good for the child? What would further their welfare, their psychological welfare, their family ties, their education? Those are not the considerations in immigration court. Again, the question is, do you merit lawful status, yes or no? So not that our court bureaucrats don't try to make some accommodations to try to make the experience more accessible and easier to children, including encouraging the provision of counsel, but they're not there to decide what's in the child's best interest. And they specifically can't turn an immigration decision on, well, I think it would be healthier and better for this child. There's no right to counsel. There's not a public defender. There is a right to counsel, but you have to pay or acquire it yourself. There's not a public defender, so you don't get to say, if you can't afford one, I want the court to appoint one for me. That just doesn't exist in immigration court. So here's a few of the forms of humanitarian relief that can be available. They all serve different purposes. They all have quite a number of qualifications that have to be met. And I usually try to explain to kids, there's very limited avenues for getting relief. You can't just say, well, I would prefer to live here and my father's here, so he said I could go to school here and that'll be good. Those are good reasons, but they're not recognized under US immigration law. So a child would have to show that they qualify for some form of immigration status. And if that parent that they just spoke about is not a US citizen, not a lawful permanent resident, then that person doesn't have any right to petition for them. So if family immigration is out, you can see where this is going. They may be able to qualify on the basis of some kind of humanitarian relief. And these are several of them. This is not an exhaustive list, but there's some of the ones that are more common when we work with children. Asylum is kind of a familiar concept to a lot of us because it's designed to protect against persecution. It's persecution that's based on a person's race, religion, ethnicity, their political opinion, or if they're a member of some type of a social group. That protection might be available. It's difficult to qualify for asylum, but many children have strong reasons to apply. Temporary protected status is tailored to specific countries. If there's a country where either a natural or a man-made disaster has really made living conditions untenable, then the US may decide that nationals of that country shouldn't have to return, at least for a while, and they can grant them a temporary lawful status and permission to work and live in the US for that limited period, however long it may last. And that is, of course, it's subject to the Attorney General deciding to extend it or not extend it. Some of the countries that have temporary protected status right now are El Salvador, Honduras, and a number of others. So T visas are for people who have been trafficked. They've either been forced into labor or into commercial sex. And U visa is designed to encourage a crime victim to not fear reporting that crime, to not fear cooperating with law enforcement, because they fear that their immigration status could be used against them or result in their deportation. So obviously, the entire community has an interest in victims of crimes being able to assist in the prosecution, being able to try to assist in the administration of justice. So we don't want to discourage immigrants, even if they're undocumented, from helping. Here's a little bit about why we do the work that we do. Having a lawyer in a child's case makes a huge difference between success and failure. Kids are actually 5 times more likely to have their case end up in being deported, in deportation, if they don't have a lawyer to help. And in the New York City area, we actually have a pretty high level of coverage because there are a lot of nonprofits working at it, but it's by no means universal. Not every person who wants, not every child who wants a lawyer in New York automatically gets one. So the need is always still there. I should also say that not all people without lawful immigration status, not all such people are in immigration court. Some people have never come into contact with the immigration system. Some people entered long ago, maybe with lawful status that they lost, or just were never detected by the US authorities. So you could be entitled to pursue lawful immigration status even though you're not in front of an immigration judge. You could do it through the application process that doesn't involve going to court. Here's one example of a policy decision that the US government made. And I bring this up to show that a lot of people express concern about the election, and with good reason. You wonder, what will the new president's policies be? There have always been difficult policies, and here's one from 2014 that I think was very challenging. The decision was made when the huge numbers of children started arriving to try to move them through the system as quickly as possible, setting very short timelines, like 3 weeks, to get them in front of the judge. What happens when you've only got 3 weeks between getting out of the detention center and getting in front of the judge? Well, you have very little time to figure out what's what. You may or may not have a seamless relationship with the adult that's supposed to be taking care of you. You may or may not be able to afford hiring a lawyer or know where to look for one. It was actually, this position got retreated from pretty quickly, but here we have it, according to the New York Times, that some officials thought, well, that was convenient, that you could, by pushing children through very quickly and resulting in their deportation, sort of disincentivize more people from coming. On the plus side, a really good thing that our government did for us was to make it easier for young children who are on their own to apply for the protection of asylum by removing some of the really difficult procedural aspects of it, like having to hurry up and file within 1 year of getting here and having to square off with a trained government attorney in front of a judge in an adversarial setting where you can get cross-examined. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but that's a very effective policy that allows children who need protection, perhaps especially if you were a victim of rape or other violence. It's not the easiest thing to just stand up and talk about in open court. So to have it in an interview setting is a really helpful accommodation. Now, that's a policy that is done in an agency memorandum, by the way. And I'm bringing this up. This is similar to the information we saw a bit earlier. How can immigration policies change in the future? Well, it's not just that Congress can amend the laws. They can, of course. They can also, courts can also take a law that Congress enacted and declare it to be invalid if it's unconstitutional. Those are some pretty high bars to hit if someone wants change. It's difficult to bring about an act of Congress. But a lot of other policies are not acts of Congress. They are those regulations that we talked about earlier that get amended at the agency level. The agency is circumscribed by the boundaries that Congress set for them. But within those boundaries, they can make different choices that make immigration policy look very different in one way or another. And there's a lot of latitude within that. Court decisions, again, they're going to be very fact-dependent. So just because this person's case came out that way doesn't mean yours will. And finally, a lot of policy gets handed down by the agencies in the form of, say, a public or even an internal memorandum that says, this is how we're going to handle this set of facts. Policy of letting children go in a more child-friendly route to seeking asylum, that's one example where it was set through an agency memorandum. That is vulnerable because it could be changed. The next agency could say, well, we don't believe that. We don't think that was a good use of resources. We're revoking it effective immediately. That can happen with anything that's at the agency level. One very famous program that is an executive action is, of course, DACA, Deferred Action. And that was a very successful program. A lot of young people were able to apply for that and acquire a deferred status for a temporary period where you are not, although you don't have permanent lawful status, you are not subject to being deported, and you also get permission to work lawfully, which is very valuable. So that is something that has, a lot of people have said, is vulnerable and is targeted for change in a new administration. You also probably know that because of litigation last year, a successor program, a broader, more expanded version of DACA that would have reached more young people, it would have also reached parents of people with lawful status, of citizens. So that didn't get to take effect because of litigation about whether it was proper to have such a program implemented through executive action. So again, the question, the future of that program is very much in doubt. Can it ever take effect? What will happen to the people that have DACA deferred action now? We don't think they can expect to renew it, or that the program may not exist in the future. What else will happen to them? Are they vulnerable because the government has received a lot of their personal information? And those are really important policy questions to be concerned about. I don't, of course, have the crystal ball with the answers, but I think it's something we're all going to be interested to learn as it goes on. There's a short video. Should we see that? Okay, then this might give you some questions. This is a story of one kid that Kind worked with.
name is Angela Salaya and I'm 9 years old. I am from Salvador and I've been in the U.S. 2 years and a half. I live with my grandma. She wanted me to come here to learn more things. She said my life was gonna be better in here because in Salvador it was gonna get worse. When I was in the immigration center, almost everybody was crying because they wanted their family to be with them. The rooms were really cold. Sometimes the police officers let us go outside, but to play like soccer and stuff. One day they took us to take showers and pick up some clothes. I got to Alexandria, Virginia. Somebody told my mom and me that they had picked a lawyer for me. Now I live in Alexandria, Virginia with my mom, my stepdad, and my sister.
On behalf of KIND, we are so appreciative to the 5,000 Move On members who donated $100,000. This money will go an incredibly long way to helping these incredibly vulnerable children in immigration proceedings. With the funding, we can train more pro bono attorneys among our law firm and corporate partners. We can provide representation ourselves. It's unbelievable what this will do for us. And I think it's important to know that for every dollar donated to KIND, we leverage $4 in-kind volunteer services among our partners.
I want to say thank you to KIND and all the members of Move On for helping kids like me.
The question is a good one about the reference that Angela made to being held in an extremely cold detention center. And the question is it a deliberate policy that the U.S. uses because it's widespread, it's often heard, it's often reported by immigrants who have been detained, including children, that they're held in extremely cold conditions. And I've always suspected that it was deliberate. At some point, someone asked one of the employees of, or a spokesperson for Customs and Border Protection, what is the purpose? And their answer was, to me, very unconvincing. It's, we keep it cool to inhibit the spread of germs and disease, because as if you could refrigerate people the way you refrigerate your food, that it should, I think that's extremely spurious science. Eventually, a lawsuit was brought to challenge this policy and other very negative, detrimental conditions. But it is, you're absolutely right. I'm sure you've heard it from people, and it's also reported frequently to us. Children will just refer to it as a hielera, an icebox, and report that they were given no blanket, or that they, for a while, they had a little aluminum blanket and slept on the floor. There's also rules that came about through a class action lawsuit on how long children can be held, that they can't be held with unrelated adults, that children have to be fed. A lot of, it's an amazing concept, but yes, you have to tell government officials to do that. A lot of kids have reported receiving very little food or very little water for extended periods, which is really hard for a small kid who's growing, hard for anybody, but particularly for children. So yeah, I haven't had a chance to study the court opinion at length, but so far I think that we're going to see some kind of results based on that class action lawsuit, hopefully removing that policy from the current practice. So the question was, can some of the younger children be adopted? Well, really, a person of adoption is a creature of state law. So state law will decide who can be adopted, and in many states, there's no limit. You could adopt an adult, actually. So yes, it's possible. One of the, that would depend on the requirements of the law where the child takes up residence. But another thing to note is that adoption in and of itself does not resolve the question, do you have the right to be in the United States lawfully, yes or no? It could be a part of a solution. If a child became the adopted son or daughter of a U.S. citizen, then they might, that person could petition for their son or daughter. There would be a time period that had to elapse, and that adoption would have to occur before a certain age in order for it to be an adoption that counts for family immigration purposes. But acquiring a new parent could be a good in and of itself, whether or not it resolves your immigration question. There are also other provisions under the family law of many states. I actually didn't spend much time on this solution, and I probably should have. One of the remedies that serves many, many children is a special immigrant juvenile status that attempts to provide for a child who was either abused or neglected or abandoned or maltreated in some way by one of their parents or by both of their parents. This solution attempts to provide them a secure living situation. It doesn't have to be adoption. It could be a guardianship. It could be foster care. But some living arrangement that's secure, appropriate, safe for the child, that looks for their well-being. And then if certain other requirements are met, they could also resolve their immigration status. So adoption could be part of a solution, and it could just be a benefit for itself. So the question was, is part of the grant of asylum the provision of somebody to take care of the child, or can they just receive lawful immigration status like asylum but not have a caretaker? So we'll unpack that because it's a couple of different things coming together. So remember that asylum is not the only protection. Asylum is one powerful form of protection, but not everybody qualifies for it. So let's broaden it up to any kind of protective status, right? It could be a child who's entitled to receive some form of protective immigration status, including asylum. You will notice the example of Angela's case. She was released from the detention center to her mother. Her mother was already present in the United States and ready to receive her. And that happens in a very large number of cases, that some caretaker is present, able, willing, and appropriate to take care of the child. It could be a parent, it could be a non-parent, but remember when the child back in the detention center, the child isn't let out of the detention center until that arrangement is made, until there is somebody that the federal officials believe is appropriate and capable of caring for them. And probably something like, the number varies over time, but 60 or 80% of the children can get released out of detention. Well, they may stay, or they may actually resolve and win their asylum case or win some form of relief while they're in the detention center, or they may be deported. Yes. Right. So sanctuary city, it's a colloquial term. I don't think there's not a strict legal definition for what is a sanctuary city, but there are, exactly as you said, cities that have made a decision that they don't support aggressive deportation. So. And New York has a good tradition of that. But immigration law is federal law, and there are certain federal laws that are going to be binding. People do get deported out of New York City. It most certainly does happen. But usually sanctuary cities take the form of, to what extent will there be cooperation? Do they want a one-to-one cooperation where law enforcement, for example, if somebody's arrested and criminal offenses, that it's not only the most serious ones that you can think of, but a lot of criminal offenses can make a person subject to being deported. Does law enforcement of your locality want to cooperate seamlessly with federal immigration authorities to ensure that everybody who has a deportable offense gets funneled into the pipeline for deportation? There was a memo from the Department of Homeland Security about sensitive locations where supposedly they would not enforce, and schools were among those, as well as places of worship. And that is, again, an agency memorandum, again, the most low-hanging fruit, the kind of thing that could be abrogated or changed pretty easily. I don't actually know this family, but it's a very common pattern in many, many of the families that I've met, that a parent may make a decision that our family unit is simply not economically viable. There's no way I can support my family in this country. I'm going to leave, and they may feel that their departure will be for a limited period, or that they'll be able to send for their child very soon. They may be hoping that there's a change in law, or that they can qualify for status. So, and that may or may not happen, but I'm just guessing that, I don't know this family, but in a lot of families, I should just say in a lot of families, there's an economic motivation or necessity. Her father is not mentioned in that story. We don't know whether she had a participating father, whether he was living, whether he was helpful, whether he abandoned the family. So it may be that that they just couldn't make it where they were. The comment was there has been discussion that sanctuary cities may not receive the funding that they're otherwise entitled to under the new administration. I've also heard that, and we're all kind of trying to feel the pulse and see where that's going to go. That's, I guess, one tool of compelling people to cooperate with a policy is to use funding. So yeah, we'll have to see about that. Why was it the biggest year? Yeah, a number of people, including the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, did studies to try to find that out and interviewed a lot of people. And the rise of gang violence was one of the very commonly cited reasons. In that year, the murder rates in both El Salvador and Honduras just started going through the roof. I think that's a big part of it. There also could have just been a perfect storm, like many families who had arrived at a certain time decided that that was enough separation and they couldn't stand it anymore. They didn't know who was taking care of their children. I don't really know exactly, that's somewhat of a coincidence. I don't really know how it happened, but yeah, I think a lot of factors came together. The violence is probably the single biggest reason. The question was, what is the future of the Dreamers? People who were brought to the U.S. as young children. And that's kind of, again, like a broad term that gets used and can mean different things in different contexts, but broadly speaking, it is, Dreamers refers to people who came to the U.S. as minors and didn't necessarily have, at least one of the arguments goes, they didn't really have agency. They didn't make a conscious decision, oh, I'm going to enter the U.S. without permission. They were caused to enter as children, and not necessarily with their parents. They also could have been, like Angela, following to join a parent. So it could include, in any case, it's children who, or young people who came when they were children. And so those people, or a subset of those people, as defined under the federal policy that created DACA, are people that can benefit from DACA. When we refer to deferred, it's the full acronym is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And people who met certain cutoffs for their arrival in the U.S., people who were either had completed or were completing a program of study, or had done military service and had arrived in the U.S. before a certain age and stayed a certain time. And you had to also be of a certain age to apply. So it was quite, it's once you've applied all of those qualifications, it narrows the group quite a bit, and that narrowed group were the subset of the Dreamers that were granted DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So they were given permission. It simply, when they say deferred action, it means deferring of immigration action against you. So you are not, again, you're not becoming a citizen, you're not becoming a green card holder, but negative action against you is deferred for the time being, for as long as the status lasts, and with it comes a work permit. So that has been really productive for a lot of young people who couldn't otherwise resolve their status, and that the future of that program is really very much in doubt, as we refer to the attempt to expand it to a bigger pool of Dreamers and to the parents of such of citizens did not succeed. The question is, how much cooperation is there among the government agencies? And they definitely each have different roles and different systems. There is, it's not a very satisfying answer. I know that there is some cooperation. I wouldn't call it seamless. There is information sharing. Sometimes one agency knows something about your client because they heard it from another agency. And of course, here's a really big example of cooperation. In immigration court, which is part of the Department of Justice, the government lawyer who prosecutes the case is from the Department of Homeland Security. So there's obviously a lot of coordination there to make that process work. And the question is, does kind find the kids, or do the kids come to us? And it's a carefully designed system. So the agencies that work with unaccompanied children are very well coordinated and networked, and we have constant communications with a huge network. A lot of agencies are set up to serve those detention centers along the border. So with a child like Angela, while she was in detention, it's possible that a legal worker or a caseworker from the detention center contacted KIND, or they could contact another organization to say, here's a child who's under 18 and she's heading to a region that you serve, Arlington, Virginia. Can you work with her? Can you see if can you offer her legal services? So a child is not required to work with KIND. Really, you should have your free choice as to who you want to handle a very delicate task like your legal services, but we offer. When we receive, so I used to work in our New Jersey office and in our New York office. We would receive some contact information in the form of a referral for a child. We would look to see if it's a child that's within the community that we can serve, geographically and by age. Do they live where we can serve them? Also, if they are a person that can afford their own legal services, we probably wouldn't offer. If we learn that their income is pretty high, we wouldn't offer. But we will contact that child and or that child's family and ask, would you like help in finding a lawyer? Would you like us to assist with legal services? So the legal services should be provided in the locality where the child is going to be living. So for example, a child could transit through Arizona because maybe they crossed the desert and ended up in Arizona and were held in a shelter there, say in Phoenix, for example. Now, when the workers in Phoenix look around and try to answer the question, well, who could this child live with? Do you know anybody in the United States? And the majority of the children do. They have contact with a relative that they think they could be with. And if that person checks out, if it truly is the child's relative, because the officials will ask for proof. They're not going to just release a child willy-nilly to someone who's posing as a relative. That could actually be a trafficker. So that some care would be taken to try to make sure that that doesn't happen. So once the child is released to a location where they'll be living stably with an adult, then that's the time to offer the legal services. It's not that they could never move. Some families could pick up and move, or they might make a decision for their child or their niece to live with some other relative in some other location. That can happen. But you certainly, you need to deliver the legal services where the child is living, because you have to be able to meet with them, ascertain their wishes. What is it that you want me to do for you, and what's possible under the law? So the question was, if a child born here in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen, because we have birthright citizenship, regardless of whether their parent is undocumented, does the child's status as a U.S. citizen help that parent? And the answer is yes and no. There's a very common pejorative that you'll hear a lot in the media called anchor babies. We don't believe that benefits should be given based on a so-called anchor baby, which is another one of the terminologies that I don't like to use. But it also, I won't say that it never ever matters. So for example, DACA was exactly a program that was intended to assist someone who made a family here, raised young people who are productive members of their community, and that adult, if they've been law-abiding all this time, why shouldn't they be offered a chance to at least, even if not have to have permanent status, could they regularize their status? There's another way that that, as we mentioned before, a U.S. citizen has the right to petition for certain close relatives, and a parent is one of those. So once a U.S. citizen is an adult, they could petition for a parent, but it won't be just a seamless process. That person would need to qualify. Been unlawfully present in the United States for a long time, they might have to sort out and do certain things to sort of overcome an immigration violation before they would be allowed to regularize their status. Finally, there's the use of discretion. So I'll give an example from the children's, the unaccompanied children's world. Some of the children that we work with become parents. Some children became pregnant in the home country or maybe during the journey. Very often, sadly, it's as a result of rape. If that baby is born in the U.S. and is a U.S. citizen, that could be a reason to grant, for the government to use some of its discretion, and the government is pretty limited in how they'll use their discretion, but they could decide that here's a young parent struggling who's a victim of violence, who has a US citizen child. Maybe that's not the person that we have to go gunning for. Maybe we can let this little family unit live here without rushing to deport them. You can't necessarily grant lawful immigration status on just what I said alone, but the government could choose not to fully prosecute the deportation of that person. Family ties to a US citizen could be one reason. More recently, the government has been more reluctant to offer that kind of forbearance, probably because of the volume. I think it's an important question in New York City. What can you do at the local level or the city level as against negative and more aggressive policies? Especially we have the support of a lot of city institutions. And I have to say that our city government has really championed immigrants' rights, and they have put their money where their mouth is and put up money for funding to provide legal services, both to children and also to adults who are in detention. So that by being in New York City, that's a huge advantage right there. But there are other things like the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs is a very active office in community engagement. And I know that what that office was hoping was that the lawsuit against expanded deferred action, they were hoping that it would end differently than it did, and that they could be instrumental in helping lots of people access the right to work and some measure of stability in their lives. That didn't happen, but the office is still active, concern, available, hoping that we can be prepared if some positive policy comes into effect. Another amenity that I think is really useful is, well, how many people have ID NYC? It's a really good thing to do. So ID NYC was designed to give a form of identity document to someone that didn't have the 4 points or 6 points or whatever it is that you need at the DMV. If you're living in undocumented existence, it's extremely difficult to prove who you are, where you are, and how long you've been there. And those are sometimes things that you might need to prove in the future if you're ever trying to qualify for lawful immigration status, or if you ever do need to prove it for any reason. The sort of federally funded benefits that an undocumented person can get are vanishingly small. It's extremely close to none. So it's not as if people are able to take advantage of lots of programs. And it's also just a precarious existence in terms of being able to open a bank account without ID, being able to get a driver's license. That's a separate, huge policy question. New York doesn't grant driver's licenses to undocumented people. Is that a good idea from the road safety point of view? That's a question well worth asking. But since you can't otherwise get most normally available, freely available forms of government-issued ID, New York decided to make ID NYC available. You still have to show there is a fairly rigorous, they'll work with people, and as long as they can cobble together enough ID to establish that they're a city resident and what their identity is, then you can get this photo ID. And there are even some banks that will take ID NYC. A lot of people who are not immigrants, and you could go down to the DMV and get a driver's license or a non-driver's ID if you wanted to. A lot of people went out of their way to get ID NYC so that it doesn't have to become something that's just for undocumented immigrants. That, by whipping the card out, which I showed to get in here today, it doesn't signify that the person holding it is an undocumented immigrant. So that's a great thing to get. And I think just talking, debating, and persuading, I'm becoming more convinced that one-on-one discussion with people whose viewpoints you think are unproductive, I think is really, it's very close to home. It sounds very simple, but I think it's probably one of the more important things that we can do. The City Council can consider legislation that affects sort of how immigrants live and work in New York City, but the New York City Council can't, of course, grant immigration status. Our family courts are really instrumental to serving children. A family court process can be instrumental to children who have been abused or abandoned or neglected in satisfying some of the prerequisites to show that because of this maltreatment, they should qualify for protection. So that's our state courts acting almost in an advisory capacity, but making decisions that state family courts make every day. Did this father commit neglect against his child? Would it be in this best interest of the best interest of this child to live with her aunt or to live with her grandmother? Let an experienced family judge decide that question, and in so doing, they can help establish the factual basis why this person should qualify for immigration status. So there's some involvement at the state and local level, but no ultimate decision making on immigration status.